Hello, Salt Strong Nation. Joe Simons, like diamonds. We are back another Tackle Tuesday. Got my boy Tony, Wyatt, Marky Mark and the Funky Bunch, and Luke. Luke's doing a little cool little experiment right now with some new scent that we are trying out. Scent that we would be applying to both paddletails and split tails. Guys, this is going to be a good one. A lot of our most viewed videos on YouTube this year have been on swim bait / paddletails and rigging, retrieving, catching inshore slams, and also, and this is the new Slam Shady Bomber. If you guys are watching this, I know we're recording this for a podcast as well, and this is the Alabama Leprechaun Jerk Shad. Two of our top selling lures on fishstrong.com. And we get a lot of questions about the two of these, when to use one versus the other. If Slam Shady's so good and it's the best lure ever, why you even have this one? Well, there are times that you want to have different types of lures, including topwater, etc. There's no one lure that's going to always win 100% of the time, except for SlamShady.com. So guys, kick it off. Who wants to lead with this thing? When do you guys lead? When are you leading with one of the two, split tail versus a paddle tail?
I'll start because I just have a really basic decision point, and
he's a basic guy. Didn't even cut his hair.
Yeah, real basic. And so my default is Slam Shady because it's just proven that we've had it now for I guess a year and a half. It's been working all season. I absolutely love it. It's the paddle tail. But when it's calm and clear conditions, that's the time where I go to the Leprechaun. And just so you can see what we're talking about here. So this is the Leprechaun. It's a split tail jerkbait. It has great darting motion. It has very little vibration. And that's the reason, right? So very clear water, especially when there's fish are spooky up in the shallows, the quick little darting motion looks really nice, and it doesn't have too much vibration to make it seem unnatural. It's not natural for a big paddle tail to be sloshing around and making a much vibration in the shallows. So that's my decision. So otherwise, I'm throwing the Slam Shady, and then my decision point is, do I go with the smaller one or the bigger one? And obviously based on the size of the bait. So that's my decision point in a nutshell.
So my decision's a little bit different. I agree with the paddle tail being something you don't really want to use in clear water, but the jerk shad is something that I'll use in clean or dirty water. I was on a recent trip, very dirty water. You know, you couldn't see maybe 2 or 3 inches in the water. And I was using the paddle tail, but I was seeing a lot of shrimp jumping around. I even had a couple jump into my kayak. And the jerk shad is something that can resemble a bait fish, and it can really effectively resemble a shrimp too, as far as the darting action. And because this has, you know, the gold flash in it and that sort of darker green color, really simulates a shrimp really well. So I was throwing the paddle tail at first and I wasn't getting any strikes. Started seeing shrimp jumping around. I was like, okay, let me find something that matches that, and immediately started catching reds using the jerk shad, and the water was dirty. So all a matter of really just matching what's going on around you.
And you had it rigged on looks like a owner twist lock hook.
Yeah, this is a 3/0 1/16 ounce twist lock. And that's the nice thing about all these baits too. They all rig up really well on this one hook. So you can have it tied onto one rod, be able to switch between multiple different types of baits without having to take the hook off.
Yeah, and uniquely different from the two, mine is more based on locating fish. So what I traditionally do is I have a swim bait or paddle tail style of bait covering water to find the school. And then I slow down and methodically pick them apart with a split tail. So mine is more of a, presentation and finding versus one source being different than the other. And the split tail, to me, it depends on how aggressive I'm fishing it. To me, I have found myself in the colder months using less weight to where it takes more time for that bait to come back to me and a little bit higher in the column, versus the summertime, I traditionally fish it with a heavier twist lock hook and work it more aggressively and work it faster as a twitching jerkbait would be. So to me, it's a time frame year and it's a water covering basis. As far as color goes, I'm also kind of on Tony's side. I like using that particular jerkbait in dirty water as well. It's a confidence thing to me, and I found that it to work well. But I like to slow down with the jerkbait, cover water with my swim bait.
Let's talk about jig head sizes and hook sizes. I saw Brandon here ask, is 1/4 ounce jig head with 3/0 hook too small for slam shady bomber or leprechaun?
Depends on the depth. It's the jig head is all about the depth. So there's not really a 3/0 size hook will cover all of them pretty well, even the bomber. The bomber is the bigger one, just so you know. So the bomber is the 5-inch thick. The leprechaun is 5 inches, but really thin. 3/0 works great for both. A 4/0 is probably a little bit better for the bomber, but again, the 3/0s work. And then the smaller one, the 2.0, is 3.5 inches and pretty thin. So the 3/0 size hooks are good, are fine, or adequate. You can do 4/0, and the weight though is really dependent on the depth you're covering.
Yep.
So there's not like, oh, you have to get this weight or not. Like the 1/16 ounce that Tony mentioned is awesome for up in the shallows. They now came out with a 1/8 one. So an 1/8 ounce weight on this twist lock hook is relatively new. And I really like it because it can cover the shallows as well, but also cast a little bit further. But then if I'm fishing like more than 2.5 feet of water, I go to a jig head. It'll start with 3/16 ounce. And then if I'm getting like 5 feet of water, or if there's heavy current, then I'll do a 1/4 ounce. And then even go higher as I go deeper. Is that about what you guys do?
Yeah,
Go for it.
I'm
Jim.
usually not fishing any deeper than 4 feet really. So I pretty much stick to the twist lock. Also where I fish, there's really not much current, so I don't have to worry about that either. But like when I do fish over by you, Luke, Tampa, those areas, I usually go with like the Texas side jig head or just a regular jig head. I like the Texas side because it gives you that, weedless feature, but still the similar action of a regular jig head.
Let me pull one out for those who don't know the Texas eye. Those are solid jig heads, and it's basically like an old school worm hook that has a jig head mounted to the front of it. So it's pretty cool. That way you can have the benefits of a jig head where you can get that lure down quicker, but you have the benefits of the worm hook where you can keep it weedless. So this is relatively new as well, and it's been awesome. I'm a big fan.
Now, do y'all change any of that scenario in cold water versus warm water? Because for me, I use lighter weights in the wintertime just for that bait to take a longer time frame to come back to me at the boat. I can really just work it real slow for those cold lethargic fish. Or if I want to do a really hard, erratic pop to my rod tip to make that jerkbait just really dark, hard to one side, that lighter weight to me allows me to cover a different kind of water column versus summer. I'm a turn and burn kind of guy.
Yeah, I think it's like the extreme temperatures, like extreme heat and extreme cold. That's when you really want to slow down, use a lighter weight. And then, like you said, in the spring and the fall, the temperatures are more comfortable for the fish. That's when I find they're more aggressive. So yeah, like using a heavier jig head or a heavier weighted hook, give the lure more of a faster darting action, can definitely help.
Yeah, well, Captain Justin Napier, one of our insider members, and he's actually been a guest on this podcast. He says, I like the erratic movement of the jerkbait when I'm looking for a reaction bite. The paddletail really shines in the cooler months when the water is cool and the fish are a little bit slower, in my opinion. Good stuff. And by the way, we got an email from Daniel Nussbaum, the president of Z-Man. And we got, if you guys didn't see the post already, should be this week, we will have the Z-Man Slam Shady Paddletails back in, definitely in the Minnow Z to start. We are also going to have a couple new or two new for us, but existing molds from Z-Man that they're going to add Slam Shady to, which we're really stoked. And then 2 more after that, all here before Christmas. So definitely be looking at fishstrong.com. This first round is going to go super fast. I'm going to apologize in advance because there's going to be people who are ticked off, and we've already told the team we can't go out there as much as we want to and buy them first. We have to let our insider members first. So we're going to notify our insider members first, then the public, and then us. These are going to go super, super fast based on what we know and how long we've been waiting for them. This whole COVID thing was an absolutely killer, but just wanted to throw that out there. Z-Man Slam Shady Paddletails coming back, and some split tails. Whammy.
Gonna be good.
Oh,
Very good.
boy.
So Wyatt, curious to hear your thoughts on the paddletail. So Wyatt, for those who don't know, is fishing the North Carolina, really both Carolinas. And I see you use the paddletails a whole lot more. Do you use split tails much there?
Yeah, so really the determining factor for me is the water depth. So Tony was talking earlier, he's not usually fishing more than 4 feet of water, not a whole lot of current, and he absolutely crushes it with jerk shads up there. I'm very jealous how many fish and the quality of fish that he catches on those jerk shads. But here up in the Carolinas, we've got a lot more current. Water's really dirty, and I'm fishing deeper water as well. So the paddle tail allows me to cover, I feel like, a little bit more of the depth columns because the action is the tail kicking, right? With the jerk shad, I find that what attracts the bite is twitching that bait and then letting it settle back down to the bottom. I can't work the middle of an open column on a shelf for trout, I find, as well with a jerk shad, just because out in the open water, having to let it settle back down to the bottom takes forever. And I don't think that there's as much action, just in my opinion, as there would be with the paddle tail. Now, conversely, up in the marsh, when I've got redfish or flounder that are really, really shallow, I am going to pull out that jerk shad if I see that they're sight feeding. Specifically for flounder, I had a really good video that came out, and the Alabama leprechaun is a deadly option when those flounder are sitting in, less than a foot of water, because they really key in on vertical movements. With paddle tails, in less than a foot of water, I can't really bounce it that well because it's going to come out of the water. With the jerk shads that really flutter really well and then settle back down, there's such a much larger window for those flounder to bite. And I really do crush it on that jerk shad when it's really, really shallow. With the paddle tails, I do really good on flounder when it's more than like 3 or 4 feet. I haven't had too many opportunities to hit the redfish up, but I know a lot of folks around here, that's their go-to bait, especially up in the grass, putting it on an owner twist lock. In my kayak, I don't really get those opportunities. I can't see too high up, but I'm trying to do a little bit more of that. And those redfish I know will definitely crush those things up in the grass as well.
Good
I've noticed something with Wyatt. The better his beard looks, the better his advice gets.
It's science.
It's science. Hey,
Yeah.
So John Freeman, one of our probably longest standing insider members, and we got a little surprise coming for you, John, next year, and anyone who is hitting their 5-year anniversary as an insider member. John says, do you use a loop knot with the Texas eye that we just talked about, the Texas eye jig head?
So Texas eye. So I always have, or I mostly have. And for those who don't know, again, that's the one with the hook that's kind of wobbling around on the jig head. I've tested out the snug knot just to see if there's any difference, and I really can't tell that much of a difference. So I've used them both, and they both work.
Which one has a higher knot strength?
The snug knot has a higher knot strength. That's the benefit. So the benefit of the snug knot is higher knot strength. The benefit of a loop knot is more motion in the water. But I think the reason why John asked is because since you have this swivel, the motion is now, at least on the back half, is now swiveling around. So that's going to have the good motion in the water. Like looking at, I've done the underwater camera on both, and they both have a good wobble. So I think you can go either way. The snug knot, you'll have a little bit higher breaking strength. I personally prefer my knot to the lure to be a little bit weaker, so that when I do get snagged, it obviously will happen, especially in deep. I want the break to happen right here. I don't want the break to happen on my line to line knot. That way I can just quickly get my line back, retie another bait, and I'm good to go. So I actually prefer to make this knot just slightly weaker than everything else, so that I can just save time on the water. So for that reason, I still use the loop knot, even though I can't tell a difference on effectiveness.
Yeah, I would say you can't go wrong with the loop knot, especially with those jig heads. Sometimes you may rig the lure really close to the head of that jig head, and that will keep it from being able to pivot around much. So the loop knot can help if that does happen. And
Yeah. Go for it, Tony.
I was going to move on to talking about Z-Man baits, how the difference in buoyancy will affect how much weight you want to use when using those baits compared to the other traditional soft plastics. So Z-Man baits, they're more buoyant. You know, you toss one in the water unrigged, it's going to float on the surface. If you toss some other type of soft plastic, it's going to hit the water and it's going to slowly start to sink. So when you're rigging up, you know, Z-Man baits that are the elastic material, you have to consider rigging them up a little bit heavier than you would if you were using like, for example, compare these two. This is a Z-Man. This is the 3-inch Minnow Z. This is the 2.0, the Slam Shady 2.0. This one you can rig up. Let's say I rig it up on a 1/16 ounce weighted hook normally. If I'm rigging the Z-Man Minnow Z, I want to rig that up on about a 1/8 ounce to get that same depth and that same action. Because you'll notice if you rig both of these up on a 1/16 ounce, the Minnow Z is going to ride really high up in the water column, and it's almost going to be riding right on the surface. So if you want to work those lures deeper, make sure to go heavier when you're using the Z-Man baits because of the buoyancy.
Yeah, that's a great point, and that's a little trick to do if you're, say, I mean, somebody mentioned a 1/4 ounce jig head. Is that good enough? The answer is obviously yes, but you can actually control the depth you're running. Say you're in like 3 feet of water with a 1/4 ounce jig head is a little bit heavy for 3 feet of water unless there's a lot of current. You could put the Z-Man material on there, and that's going to have it riding up really nice for that 3 foot. And then if you go down to 4 or 5 feet and you don't want to retie or you don't want to have another rod, then you can just take off, you know, undo the Z-Man, put on the 2.0 version that's a little bit more dense, and that'll ride a little bit lower. So that way you can control your depth without having to retie or bring a second rod.
Yep.
And I want to add one more thing before I forget. So on the Texas side, we kind of sold it pretty well. So I want to kind of caveat it with that. These are great for, again, we mentioned before that it's a jig head that's weedless. They're really bad for skipping. So if you're trying to skip under docks or anything, the fact that it pivots, it is awful for skipping. So skipping under docks, I used a traditional jig head that has that little wire weed guard. But for like buzzing over oyster bars and stuff like that, these are excellent. But for skipping, they're awful.
So have you tried, when you find you're having issues skipping, have you tried purposely pushing the lure closer up to the head of the jig head to keep it from wobbling?
It helps. It helps. It's still not as good as a normal jig head, just because that normal one, it's fixed and it'll have a flat plane that's fixed. And so yeah, until what Tony's saying is just rig it much further up. That way the head is kind of fixed. It'll still wobble a little bit, but yeah, it significantly helps. But I still prefer the traditional weedless jig head. It's just that little wire guard. It actually works pretty good.
Do you I'm curious from you guys on a split tail, are you ever using jig heads or very rarely? I haven't seen you, Wyatt, Luke.
The only time whenever I'm doing a jig head is when I'm in a trout bite only and I don't set the hook. But that was back home in Texas and Louisiana. You know, to me, all you had to do is just real line pressure and you got the fish hooked. Versus Florida was different just because of the redfish scenario where you would put, you know, some good pressure on it. But most of the time it's all a worm hook or weedless approach for me.
Okay, so we're agreeing that on the split tail, like a jerk shad, we're not using a jig head very rarely.
Not as often.
Okay.
Sometimes not as often, because I love the paddle tail, because the paddle tail, you get that fall, the fall of the tail is just doing a nice little dance on the way down, and a lot of strikes happen then. So that's like anytime I'm using a 1/4 ounce jig head or more, it's the paddle tail, just because that added benefit.
So back to the paddle tail now, what percentage time do you use a jig head versus like an owner twist lock hook, a weighted hook?
50-50.
To me, it's based on the structure I'm fishing.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I've got a lot of oyster bars up here in the Carolinas. And when I'm fishing shallow water, usually those reds will push up, not even necessarily onto the oyster bars, but there's a bunch of scattered shells and stuff. And I'm usually working the bottom because those fish that are in shallow water, they're usually punching around for crustaceans and stuff, even if flounder are shallow. But my bait is usually closer to the bottom. And that's when I'm going to put on those Texas eyes, those owner twist locks, just because you're going to get hung up if you tried to do twitch pause at all. So it's really situation dependent, but I wouldn't say that I Yeah, I don't use it too often, I would say.
Tony, I feel like you've caught some of your biggest redfish and snook with the twist lock on a paddle tail. Or is that just
Yes.
me?
With the fish over here, well, back when there was some grass left, I was using that twist lock to just basically run that paddle tail just above the grass. If you use a jig head, most often than not, you're going to cast it out. And as before you can, close the bail and get your lure retrieved, it's already in the grass. And then you're trying to get grass off of it half the time you're retrieving it. So if you rig it weedless, cast it out, start retrieving it, and you don't have to worry about getting snagged up.
Yeah, but the split tails do work good on jigs. I mean, I've seen a lot of people with really nice fish on jigs. So it's not to say that it doesn't work. I think we often are fishing a little bit shallower water. Like I've seen Justin left a comment on here that he uses the split tail in like 15 to 20 feet of depth. And that's a very important thing to think about, because to get that far down, with that paddle, as it's going down, that's water drag. Like as that tail is fluttering, that's just drag on the bait. It's going to make it sink slower. And so for fishing the deeper water, just to get down there, which is depth control is incredibly important. And so a lot of it comes to depth control. If you need to get down deeper and you don't have a really, like probably need like a ounce weight to get a paddle tail down that deep. If you don't have a really heavy weight, if you don't get down there, you're not going to catch anything. So you might as well use something that's more streamlined so it shoots down. Even though I've seen using the 2.0, it has like a really thin tail. Every once in a while, a puffer or whatever will bite it, take the tail off, and I'll keep using it. And I've actually caught some of my best fish without the tail, particularly on the deeper ends of the dock. And the reason, at least I think a big reason, is because it sinks down faster. So my retrieve is actually right on the bottom where most of the action happens. And if I had the tail on, it would have been raised up a little bit too high in the column. So a lot of it's depth control.
I think I agree too with Mark about the type of species. Not so much, I haven't really tried it too much with the jerk shad, but I've used it with a gulp shrimp, which is very similar. It's like a stick type of bait. I've tried the gulp shrimp on a twist lock hook and I wasn't catching anything. Switched to a jig head and I started catching trout, because they like that more erratic darting retrieve. So I think the type of species you're going after can definitely play a factor in how you want to rig it up, either a jig head or a twist lock hook, based on how active the fish are.
Cool.
Ideally, though, to go on the jig head side, though, on the swim bait, to me, I would always prefer an exposed hook when I can get away with it. So again, like what Tony was saying, I like fishing grass, and I can't necessarily get away with a jig head in that scenario because all I'm doing is dredging the bottom. But when I can get away with using a jig head, I would much prefer to go that way because my hookup ratio is so much better with an exposed hook versus one that has to kind of penetrate through the plastic.
Cool. I saw Jake Brannigan. Oh, go for it, Tony.
I was going to say that comes down to rigging too, because you can get away with rigging the slam shady by poking the hook out the top and just not even skin hooking it, just letting it rest there, and that'll still keep it pretty weedless. And also, this is a tip I shared in another video. You can actually rig them upside down. The slam shady, the 2.0, has a slot in the belly, and so does the bomber. If you rig them upside down, go ahead and show you here. That hook basically lays in that slot, and it doesn't even have to push through the plastic. All it has to do, fish strikes, and the hook point's exposed because the hook's just sitting in that slot, and you still get the same action out of it. So just a little counter there, Mark, as far as rigging up on jig heads and twist lock hooks.
Yeah, and a lot of it is motion too. I'll show you an interesting story last week. And so I was trying to catch ladyfish, and ladyfish, they really like a quick darting.
Wait, you were trying to catch ladyfish?
I was doing a cut bait. Yeah, sorry, I should have caveated. I was doing a cut bait lesson. We've had some requests for it, so I was going out to catch ladyfish to use as cut bait.
Okay.
And the little junk fish was tearing up the tail, so it was about that size, and this front part was all gnarled up. So it was one of those situations. Why you have a funny term for it? You get pantsed or whatever. When you cast it, it slides down the hook. It's super frustrating. So I got tired of it, so I rigged it backwards. Like I literally had this little nub tail, and I rigged it on the tail
Kids
And
at home, please do not follow this advice.
no, listen. So I rigged it just like this. And as long as this is kind of a poor rigging job. So as long as it doesn't look like this, where it's all, as long as it doesn't look like this, where it's all curled up like a snake. If it's linear, if it has a good darting motion, fish will hit it. And literally with this tail, let me do it. So let me do myself a little bit better justice.
I got $10 on there. Ain't any fish hitting that bait.
Yeah, you're right. Maybe a puffer.
Maybe a blind bass.
But so anyhow, so I was literally trying to catch ladyfish, and like 3 casts later, this one's a little bit better, but it's a nice linear little darty motion. 3 casts later, this is the natural head of it. 3 casts later, I hooked in this big fish, and it was like a 30-inch snook, and it broke me off because I wasn't ready for it. Like the line was a little dinged up, and so it just goes to show that everything doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be like the perfect paddle tail or not paddle tail. If it just has a good darty motion and looks like something that they're going to eat, like a small bait fish or an injured or a scared shrimp, they're going to take a swipe at it.
So what I'm hearing you say is Slam Shady 2.0 is now 3.0. So you got the swim bait paddle tail gets bitten off by a puffer. Now all of a sudden you got kind of a little jerk shad. And then if you flip it upside down, now you got a Ned rig.
Yeah, I mean, you'll see the video coming out. It was all on film. I'm just so bummed that I was so bummed when that thing got off, because you would have seen that little nub. It works. It's really about having good motion. I mean, the core purpose of a lure is you need to get on the proper depth. You need to have a lure that's good enough and give it some good action, and even good fish will eat it surprisingly frequently.
Yeah, I actually have an insider report that's up, and you can see the video because I had my camera rolling when I did it. There were some reds, and this is before the Alabama Leprechaun came out, so I didn't have the option to use it. But I had the 2.0, and the reds were really, really skittish, and they were really, picky. I took my 2.0 and ripped it off to about that size. It looked exactly like a Ned rig, and that's what I was thinking of when I did it. There's just a bunch of really small shrimp jumped around. This was in the spring down in South Carolina, but I've the video purposely ripping off the tail down to that nub and just really tiny twitch, pause. And I caught it was like a 25, 26 inch redfish on that nub, went further down the channel and caught another one. It was like, that paddle tail, if you take the tail off, you can now turn it into a jerk shad essentially, because you can make it dart and stuff like that. So I guess that is a pro over the jerk shad. You can't turn the jerk shad into a paddle tail, but you can turn the paddle tail into a jerk shad. And
a little Ned. That thing looked like a little stub.
Yeah, and the same premise holds. That's why I really like soft plastics, is because you can control the size. Like White, you nailed it, where you saw the smaller bait fish, so you purposely tore stuff off. Like even these jerk baits, I used to use the gulp ones all the time, but for all of them it works. Where like bait fish will eventually start tearing it off, and even the small little nubs. If it's just this little nub, I've got some of my best fish on it. And it skips better, like skipping under mangroves. The little nubs skip incredibly well. And if there's smaller bait fish in the area, it's your advantage to shrink it down. And so with soft plastics, if you can go ready for the bigger stuff, and then if you on the water and you see small stuff, just rip the tail off. You don't have to retie to get a different lure, and you can be catching more fish because of that time saving. So that's a big reason why I love soft plastics.
And for those of you that fish for small juvenile tarpon and you get frustrated because they won't hit your lure, before we had the Slam Shady, I would take some white paddle tails. I was throwing them for small tarpon. They weren't hitting. And I did the same thing. I cut the tail off, made a smaller profile, and it was just a nub on a jig head. And that's what they started hitting. So just that small change in profile can definitely help.
I've had redfish under dock lights hit the actual split tail of the Alabama Leprechaun. Like I took the fat body part of the Leprechaun off, and I put it was on a twist lock. I literally just took, because I don't have the Leprechaun in front of me. Luke, if you can hold it up, like the back.
You use the back off?
Yeah, about that size, put it on a twist lock, and the hook was literally sitting between the tail, and I skin hooked it onto the back. I've had redfish hit just that, exactly like that. But it was, I don't know exactly what the bait was that they were hitting under that dock light, but it was so small, just dragging it on the surface, like no action, and they will hit that.
So Jake Brannigan asked, how much does color matter for soft plastics? And ironically, Jake was one of the first people on here, and he actually caught a couple of fish this morning on the Slam Shady Bomber. So I love reading books. This is one. Whoa, just lost my note. This is one I just read. It's about using color technology to catch more fish. We did a whole podcast about this one. That's if you guys are listening on this podcast, it's What Fish See. This is by Dr. Colin Kajiyama, who's helped design tons of lures. And it's interesting. They all agree, and so have many of the guests, and so have probably most saltwater anglers. And it's interesting. This talks about everything. You can see he's got bass, he's got a redfish on here, got musky walleye. They talk about all types of fish, and in general, it seems that white and even black are two colors that tend to work all the time, kind of anywhere. And when I had Mark Sosin on, he had shared back in World War II, they gave every one of the soldiers there a little survival kit. And guess what was in the survival kit? It was a little bit of fishing line and a white bucktail, because they knew a white bucktail is one of those lures, one because of color and one just because it's so versatile that it can kind of catch fish anywhere. And it's the one lure you have if you had a survival kit. So what both these books talked about was that some colors have that underwater color shift. And red is the most obvious one. Let's see here. So if a red object is placed in a few feet of clear blue water, it cannot reflect red because the red wavelength is filtered out by the water and the objects show black. He calls it a black shift in this book. So there's certain colors that 100% make a difference. This guy, who also works for one of the biggest bass fishing lure makers, he pokes fun at the realistic lures. He's like, some of these things are so realistic, they're almost like camouflaging in with the area that you're fishing, right? He's like, you don't want them to look that real. That's why some of these simple paddle tails that mimic the motion and look like a real bait fish, but they don't have real eyeballs and real little circles and dots and lateral lines. He's like, listen, the goal of your lure is to get nailed. You do not want this thing surviving, is what he says. He's like, I've seen some of the most asinine lures made that cost a fortune. They look so realistic and they're horrible at catching fish. And I thought that was really interesting from a guy who designs lures. But Luke also hit it, just being candid. Color is very, very important. This guy says it's at the very top, but he also says it's right there with, you got to have action first. You got to have something that looks good in the water and looks natural. And then you got color, and then you got scent as well. All three of those combined to have a lure that's going to consistently work most of the time. Nothing works 100% of the time, unfortunately, or they would just call the sport catching and not fishing. Thoughts on that ramble of my color? Because I love reading this stuff. I'm just like you. I'm always trying to get an edge, right? I want to know all these little small things, and it's interesting that no one has come up with a perfect color, but that whole white, off-white with a little bit of sparkle, which is why we came up with Slam Shady and trademarked it, is because this is proven to work over and over again, pretty much anywhere you got predator fish.
Yeah.
A good way.
I was going to say, I did a segment on, there's a tip video. I can't remember which one it was, but I actually put up a color chart, and the color reduction spectrum really occurs on two levels. And it's actually dependent on the tint of the water, clear water versus murky water. And it was interesting to see which colors showed up on both of those two spectrums. And really, clear water right behind white was actually blue. Like if it's like offshore clean blue water, like bright blue is actually a really good color to use. But you get into the dirty water, bright blue is like very bottom of the spectrum. Then it's fluorescent orange and yellow, which is why chartreuse tends to work really well in those waters. But white is even ahead of those, because if you think the color reduction occurs because that light comes through the surface of the water, if there's more sediment and murk in the water, less light's getting through. So that white has the ability to reflect the most light, which is why it leads in both categories, regardless of, what other colors are on that spectrum. Some will perform better in clear water versus dirty water, but white is the leading factor in both if you look at any color reduction spectrum chart.
Cool little study here. So he's talking about how predator fish forage by sight. which is going to talk about the action and the color, right? So it says in an experiment, Dr. Lauren G. Hill found that fish use sight almost 100% in their selection of food. Yes, they are influenced by sound, smell, texture, and taste, but sight is their dominant sense by far. How did we determine this? This is pretty awesome. We put translucent caps over the fish's eyes and found that they could only find natural food, which was crawfish, in 6%, not 60, 6% of the times offered. But when they took the caps off their eyes and then plugged their olfactory opening so they could not smell the food, they found the food 100% of the time. It's pretty interesting. So it became very obvious that the fish may know that food is nearby through their senses, but if they can't see it, they have a really, really hard time getting it. I thought that was a pretty cool study there by a real scientist.
That's how I find my food.
No, it usually starts by smell for me.
I can see a fast food restaurant from miles away before I smell it.
That's pretty funny. Oh gosh. Let's talk about we talked about rigging, talked about colors here. Let's talk about size, right? People sometimes, especially maybe some newer anglers, like, all right, well, what's the difference between a 3 and a 5 inch? And you have a lot of different sizes now of these jerk shads or split tails as well. What are your thoughts when you guys go to a smaller versus bigger? Times of the year, matching the hatch, just what you're feeling like? What's the answer?
I would say time of the year and also water clarity. Darker water, I think the bigger baits excel just because a bigger bait's going to make a lot more commotion. It's more of a pressure change as it's moving through the water. Even if it doesn't have a paddle tail on it, just the movement of that bigger bait going through the water is going to create a pressure change, which those fish can pick up with their lateral line. And as far as, the baits that do have the paddle, if you're fishing dirty water, that paddle definitely helps. Doesn't matter if it's a 5-inch bait or a 3-inch bait, that paddle can help. And again, the dirtier the water, I'll go with a bigger bait. But then it comes down to the season, time of year. At the end of the year and into the fall, bait fish are at their biggest. They've had all year to pretty much grow, and it's going to be ideal to match the size of those bait fish. But I really feel that you can't go wrong with a 3 to 4-inch bait all year long. That's pretty much my go-to. But if I find that they're kind of snubbing that smaller bait, then I'll move up to a bigger bait and see if they strike.
Yeah, same here. Yeah, I basically, for paddle tails, my default is 4. And then if it's fall like it is now, I'm only using the 5 just because the fish are honed in on it and it helps me cast further. You can cover more ground, more
The Bama.
The Bama. And then in like late winter, early spring, when there's a lot of small bait fish, like the situation where I was talking about, where you're seeing all the little glass minnows, like the little small things, that's when I use nubs. That's when I save all my messed up ones. I save those for when the bait's small.
That's hopefully before Otis eats them. And
yeah.
Oh, man.
Yeah, Otis is he's been known to eat some slam shadies and leprechauns. But for the leprechaun, the difference though is that when I'm doing split tails, I'm almost always using the 5-inch ones because, and Tony hit on it earlier, this does a really good job of mimicking shrimp. And in many cases, the shrimp are a little bit bigger, or at least I want to be bigger than what's out there. Because when you do this on a weighted hook and give that double twitch motion, it looks just like, looking at the underwater footage, it looks just like a scared shrimp coming out of the grass and then slowly going down, and those fish hammer it. But if I'm using it and I see all little small stuff, that's the very rare instance when I purposely will take a split tail off to a nub. So that's basically my.
And I know there's some 4 inches now in the split tail that are selling pretty well.
Yeah, the smaller it is, the shorter you can cast is the downfall. Like if you're doing the finesse fishing, like everybody was talking about earlier, where you have it on the weighted hook, fishing slow. As that material gets smaller, that's just less weight to cast. So that's one thing to think about. And particularly in the wintertime when it's really clear water, and the fish are up in the shallows, casting distance is incredibly important. And so for that reason, I would rather have a 5-inch that's nubbed down to a 4 than a 4-inch that's designed to be 4 inches, just for castability.
Yeah, but I think the 4-inch still has a marketplace when you're matching the hatch as well. So I agree, the 5 is more versatile long term, but 4-inch is certainly there as a need for the match the hatch timeframes of the year.
Yeah, like in the wintertime, if you're sight fishing reds and really clean water or even trout, that 4-inch bait can work really well, like a 4-inch jerk shad. But you want to also think about, your gear. You could bump down to 8-pound line. That will help you cast better. Your positioning will help you cast better. If you have the wind to your back, you're sight casting those fish, and also the current. Those smaller, lighter baits, you can use the current to bring those baits to the fish. So some different ways to think about it there.
Have you done that yet, Tony? Have you gone down to 8-pound braid?
I haven't yet, no, but it's something I've been wanting to do because I have been in that situation where I'm casting a bigger bait to those fish and sight fishing, and I'm getting a nice long cast with that bigger bait, 10-pound line, but just making such a big splash. In the wintertime, those fish are really finicky with that really clear water. So, bumping down an 8-pound line, that will help increase your casting distance, and it's still plenty strong to fight those fish out in the open flats, as long as you're not fishing around structure.
Cool. I saw Brandon's got a question here. With it being November and it's really hot outside, in the 80s, what water, at least here in Florida, maybe a little bit cooler where you are, Wyatt, mock turtleneck weather? Is it getting mock turtleneck weather?
Not yet.
Do you own a mock turtleneck?
I'm not gonna make it.
With that beard, oh golly! All right, let's just skip the question. I don't even want to think about it. With it being hot, what water temper is optimal to be considered winter fishing in y'all's opinion? Man, it's tough to even think about winter fishing when it's 80-something degrees in November.
Yeah, I personally don't even look at my weather gauge and my temperature gauge. It's if like once about 4 or 5 legit cold fronts come through, and that's when it's winter, in my opinion. Once it's significantly colder, right, colder than it was 3 weeks before, then those fish are on the move. They're not sitting there waiting with a thermometer looking for a specific temperature. They're either going to feel comfortable or they're not. And as they get more and more cold, they're going to be moving, and they're going to be moving to the warmer pockets. So
Justin Napier, who is a great captain down there in South Florida, you guys should all book him. He says when the water temps dip into the mid to low 70s, that's when he considers a lot of these predator fish to go into winter mode, which is pretty consistent. Some of them, meaning you got different types of species, obviously. Some of them are a little bit more tolerant than others, but that, for the most part, that is correct.
And that varies on region too.
Go ahead.
Yeah, that varies on region too. Like a North Carolina fish is just used to the colder temperatures, so they can handle the colder stuff. So, so we don't want to say like that. Justin's down in Marco or Naples area, and so I think that and like Wyatt's fish would probably handle the colder stuff much better because they're just used to it. So the absolute's different. And even like a fish in 72 degrees that was just in 65 degrees is going to be really active. And if the water was just 60, 75, and now they're at 72, now they're uncomfortable. So a lot of it's on relativity. So I would say focus more on the trending relative temperature versus like an absolute.
Yeah, I was about to say the same thing, because Texas and Louisiana water might be in the high 60s, where Florida water might be in the mid 70s, but fish the same time frame of the year. So again, it's just geographically and placement.
And species too, like snook get really uncomfortable really fast to the point where they could literally die if it's too cold. Whereas like I feel like trout kind of handle it the best, and then redfish are in between.
Isn't that funny? They're called weak fish and the weakest fish, but they're pretty tough.
They can handle cold temps.
Yeah.
So I sort of base it on whether or not I have to wear a jacket every time I go on the water. If I have to go out there and wear a jacket, I'm fishing as if I'm fishing in the wintertime. And then if I have to take my jacket off, like by 11 o'clock noon, then I'm going to start pushing up shallower, because the fish are doing the same thing. They're getting warmer too if the shallows are getting warmer. So I almost base it off whatever I'm doing.
Tony
That's
is a
hard.
fish. That's the conclusion.
Yeah.
I just
Think
think
like
like
a fish. Yeah, 'cause it's-
Tony, but outside of your massive costume collection closet, do you own a mock turtleneck?
I don't even know what that is, honestly.
Go ask Wyatt afterwards.
And I
Good
think
answer.
you have to clarify costume closet as well.
Is that like what Eddie wears in Christmas Vacation?
Pretty good. Yeah, please do clarify for our viewers and listeners who don't know about how amazing that you rock Halloween. Maybe you can let everyone know that what your costume closet is, that you don't have some kind of little side gig that's a little bit weird. And
Yeah, so did some Beetlejuice costumes on Halloween. That was the big thing. Really got into it more this year, but yeah, I did it 2 nights around Halloween, and it took 3.5 hours to do the makeup and all that. Did it by myself.
it was
was a
amazing.
fun
It
time.
looked better than the Beetlejuice in the movie.
Yeah,
I
it
don't know
was.
if I have a picture here I can pull up.
It was spot on. Like I hadn't seen the movie in a really long time. When I saw Tony's picture, I was like, "That is really good." And then when I pulled an old clip of the movie, I was like, "That is amazing. Like it is spot on. It is awesome." I didn't know what that turtleneck was either, Tony. So
It's good. Eesh.
I might be able to pull up a picture here by the end of the call.
Cool. So let's just go real time right now. What are you leading with? Paddletail, split tail?
Bomber, 100%.
Obama.
Yeah,
Obama.
100%.
I don't know. I'm torn. If I had to pick one lure to bring with me all the time, it would probably be the jerk shad. That's just my confidence lure. Before I started using the Alabama leprechaun, I was using the Gulf jerk shad like 99.9% of the time. It's just my confidence go-to lure. Clear water, dirty water. It's really just a matter of knowing how to use that lure, because paddletails are a little bit easier to use. They're kind of foolproof. The jerk shad, it takes a little bit more, technique.
yeah, and the jerk shad requires the rigging to be spot on. Like, because there's just less. There's the motion. It has to be kind of doing like a dart, like almost like a Zara spook underwater, where you're twitching. It's kind of going up and down, side to side. As soon as it's helicoptering, like if it's not rigged really well, it's going to helicopter and it's not going to work. But when you rig with the split tail rigged properly, it is one of the best baits. It's the best shallow water bait I've ever used. Like when I was doing tournaments, that's literally all we used for split tails on weighted hooks.
Now, have any of y'all done any kind of perimeter weighting on your jerk baits? Like cut the split fork off the back end and put like a little small nail in the back end to where the lure falls exactly, horizontal versus a nose forward fall? Have any of y'all done any kind of experiments with that?
Never tried that.
That'd be cool. Is that something they teach you at bass school?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's huge.
So
It's
tell me exactly what you're doing. Like what kind of size you said a little nail, a little weight?
Yeah, so in the bass world, we do it with Senkos, we do it with jerk baits, something with a blunt end. When we cut the fork off the jerk bait, we now have a flat end. We'll put a small little finishing nail in the back end of the bait. So you have the weight from either, your hook source and or jig head, and now you have a perimeter weighted, and now the lure falls horizontally through the water column instead of nose down through the water column. So those that are really looking for a bait fish that's kind of dying off and it's kind of just fluttering through the water column, that perimeter weight helps with that method.
So I haven't done that, but what me and Luke do with the owner twist lock hook is you can take the weight with a pair of pliers and sort of twist it, and you can slide it back, further towards of course it doesn't want to do it now, but you can
It's
slide it back further
semi-adjustable.
towards the bend of the hook. So the weight is a little bit more further back, and you can also slide it up further towards the nose. See if we can get it to come off here. There you go. So you can see I slid it up to the nose. Then you can slide it back down towards the bend of the hook. And then once you have it in position, you just squeeze it like a split shot. That'll help keep it into position. It's not going to fall as straight or as, horizontal as it would if you had like a nail in the back end, but it helps it fall a little slower when you push that weight back on the hook.
Yeah, it's a surprisingly big difference just moving that weight. It's like a 1/2 inch movement, but it's a big deal. And that's another reason why I really like those owner hooks. they're not made for it, but after you catch a fish or two, like as that hook flexes a little bit, it'll break the glue, or like what Tony did, he just broke it with the pliers. It'll move up and down. And once you actually stop it, you can cast really hard at the up position. It'll stay there. So I always have those hooks on one of my rods when I'm out, because it's awesome for the shallows. Basically, when I go out, I have a hook. I have 2 rods. I rarely take more than that. I don't like clutter. One has the weighted hook, one has a jig head, and I'll decide which one I'm using just based on depth alone.
And both of those baits too, which we haven't even segmented into, are also very, very good baits behind bladed jig heads, or like a chatterbait style of jig head. They both work extremely well if you want to have that flash component added onto it.
Yep.
Love it. Well, cool, guys. I think we got to most of the questions. There's a couple funny ones in there. Thank you, Johnny Kelly.
I was laughing at it earlier.
I've just read some
Good.
of these.
You guys wanted to see the costume. I got it pulled up here.
Oh, let's see it. Thank you, Ron Miller. Always.
There I am.
that is epic.
Hilarious.
We'll have to put a picture in the show notes. But otherwise, you guys, we'll go back. Good vibrations, Joey Antonelli. We'll go back into these comments, because I know we tend to get a lot of comments afterwards, and maybe even do some specific videos. So I know we get a ton of questions about the different types of rigs, and more importantly, when to use which lure, and then when to use what type of jig head or twist lock hook, etc. So we'll make sure to go back and answer some of those questions. And then also, please post a yes or no if you want Wyatt to wear a mock turtleneck in our next video. I'm hoping the answer is yes. I sure want to see him. And then finally, fishstrong.com to go get your Alabama leprechauns, and now quite a few different types of Slam Shady paddle tails. And as I mentioned, sometime this week, we will have the Z-Man Minnow Z back. That was the top selling Minnow Z color in the world. Yes, in the entire world for that actual body. And it's proof the sucker just works, and it works, and it works, and it lasts, which is what everyone loves about those Z-Man baits. So yes, we have confirmed that it was the #1 seller in the entire world. That includes Japan and Australia, where those guys and gals there, they like to fish and they love their lures. Just don't call them baits like I did. I got called out. Just throwing the, you said bait, and well, that ain't a bait. Down under, it's a lure. A bait stinks. It's a live bait only.
This lure here too, Joe. Let's be honest.
Yeah, but it's interchangeable as far as I'm concerned. It's like saying rod or pole. I don't get mad when someone calls it a pole. I call it a rod. I think, but down under, oh boy, we'll break a rod over your back. Called a pole.
What's the species count of the Slam Shady paddletails now? It's in the 70s.
I believe it's 80 now. And keep in mind, we're not like, it's way over 100 if we like counted all the different species of shark. We just have like shark. And so, because otherwise you can get a little bit carried away with all the different variations of sharks. But maybe we'll break it out at some point. But yeah, it's 80 like legit different unique species, which is pretty awesome. So if you guys don't know, we are trying to break a world record. I think we might already be there. I don't even know. I haven't seen what the world record is for, one specific color, one paddle tail, and 80 different species. So if you guys catch something unique, let us know. Tag us on Instagram or shoot us an email, fish@saltstrong.com with a picture or video. You got to have documented proof. It can't be just your word, because let's face it, you're a fisherman. So guys, thank you so much. We love doing these things. If you have any other topics you want us to cover, let us know as well. We did a recent one here, depending on if you're listening on the podcast or watching this live, did a couple on reels. We did some on bait casting versus spinning. We're gonna do some things on rods coming up soon. That's been a question we get a lot. And also we did a really fun one on unique lures right now. Still, even though you would think after 7-8 months of dealing with this COVID, things would get better, it's still tough to get a lot of products. I mean, we're still us and everyone else is still struggling to get a lot of the products we used to. So we're having to look at some unique places. But good news is we got Slam Shading, we got Leprechaun in the house. I think stuck to my finger there in the house. Final question, Luke, Tony, Mark, Wyatt, if you had to eat one, which one would you eat? The paddletail or the split tail?
Paddletail. The jerk shad looks like Dookie.
The jerk shad would go down smoother.
That's true. Yeah, can you imagine that one, like the very end, paddletail going down?
I don't know. Otis has pooped out like 6 or 7 Slam Shady so far, so I'm gonna have to go with that. There must be something good about him. He's only pooped out 1 leprechaun.
Wow. I don't know about either of them. I don't think I can do that.
What if one of them smelled like a cheeseburger from you mentioned that you can smell this fast food, or no, you go by sight. Didn't you?
I go by sight.
That wouldn't work anyhow.
Yeah, we'll get a cheeseburger scented paddletail.
All right.
All right, guys. Well, stay tuned. Got a lot of new content coming your way. Insiders, Wyatt's working on a really cool mini course. We're starting to add some more of these mini courses in your library. So stay tuned. And of course, if you're an insider member, 20% off the entire store. Got the holidays coming up. We got a lot of new stuff coming in. We just got Daiwa BGs. What else do we get we got some other Daiwas, didn't we, Mark, yesterday?
Yeah, we got BGs, we got Certates, a little bit of a ballistic lineup. So Daiwa is just now starting to ship. Now they come from a different factory than what the Fuego did. So the Fuegos are a couple of weeks behind the BG stuff, but I was told to expect them late November, early December timeframe on the Fuegos.
Cool.
But unfortunately, dates have been moving around quite a bit, so I'd like to see a little bit more concrete stuff first.
No Fuego.
No Fuego.
No Fuego. But we'll be saying yes Fuego when those suckers come in. Doggone. Talk about waiting a long time. All right, guys. I think that's all I got. Have an awesome rest of the day. Thank you guys who all watched and commented live. How we digress. Yes, how we digress. Talking about eating and pooping soft plastics. What in the world? Guys, we appreciate you. Let us know any other topics you want us to talk about by leaving a comment and or just hitting us up at saltstrong.com. We always put the show notes on there in the podcast section, or email us at fish@saltstrong.com. That's fish@saltstrong.com. Otherwise, we are out. Peace.